Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I've recently joined AFA and I'm Sarita Joshi. I'm a coordinator for the Capacity for Animal Protection Coalition at AFA. And once again, welcome to AFA Connect. And this first session in the main room is going to be the theory. It's going to be on the value of theory of change. Sometimes theory of change can look a little daunting for some of us who may have not worked on this exercise before starting up programs or piloting a project, but we have an expert speaker here today with us. And can we move to the next slide, please? So we have Jamie Spurgeon with us. He's from the Mission Motors, and Jamie is a monitoring, evaluation, and learning associate at the Mission Motor. He provides the support to organizations to help build their MEL capacity. And he's previously also worked at animal charity evaluators in various roles. He's been on their research team, including conducting evaluations for charities and managing their movement grants program. Jamie has a master's degree in physics from University of Nottingham. And without further ado, I'd like to give brief on what the session agenda would look like. So Jamie will start presenting, and he's going to do sort of like an interactive session. So there might be a point where you can possibly unmute yourself and participate in the discussion that he does. But I would really request everyone to please keep yourself on mute and only speak, when a question is posed or a discussion is started. And then we'll move on to the Q&A around after 45 minutes. And post the Q&A, we'll move back to the break room. Yeah. So without further ado, JB, the floor is yours.
So today I'm going to be talking through the value of the theory of change, and I'll run us through exactly why you might want to start building a theory of change, what a theory of change is, and I'll break that down in detail to make things clear and hopefully build things up step by step, but then also explain what to do with your theory of change and how you can use it to gain value for your programs. I have got a few interactive tasks as we go through this. I'm going to make use of the chat for that actually, so keep an eye out for those and throw your answers in the chat when things come up, and we can get going. So first up, I would just like to introduce the Mission Motor. We're a fairly young organization. We've been focusing on monitoring, evaluation, and learning since June 2023. So we work with organizations to help them build their own internal capacity to carry out monitoring and evaluation. And really what this looks like is to ensure that organizations can gather data to help them understand whether their programs are working as they expect, and to use that data to then generate insights and learning that then can be used to improve their work. We're working primarily in the farmed animal cause area. So that's the Mission Motor, and a core part of that work that we do is helping organizations to build theories of change. So let's move on to why you would want to build a theory of change. And to do that, I'm going to talk about the monitoring, evaluation, and learning system as a whole and how theories of change sit within that. So when we think about designing a new program, often that will be started off with an intervention design phase. That phase might include some preliminary work, things like a needs assessment to understand the needs of your stakeholders, doing evidence gathering, whether that's literature reviews, trying to understand what's already been done and how it's been done, and seeing how well that applies in your context. And then obviously determining the goals of the intervention that you want to do. Then once you've got that basic intervention in place, then the first real step in monitoring, evaluation, and learning is to then build a theory of change. And the theory of change maps out the sort of logical reasoning, each step of your the logic from the work that you're going to do, the activities you're going to carry out, all the way through to realizing that end goal, that impact that you want to see. There are several components beyond that in terms of developing assumptions and risks and indicators, which we're going to get into a little bit today. But once you've got that theory of change in place, then that forms the basis for then carrying out monitoring. So monitoring is tracking your day-to-day progress, collecting in data about the activities that you're carrying out, and figuring out data that's actually useful to collect to be able to inform and generate insights about your program. So that's a kind of a core, one of the big core components of MEL. And the other is then evaluation. So evaluation is more complex, more involved. You might be looking at several indicators that you're collecting in your monitoring work. And that's really to try and get at the impact that your program is having. And if possible, doing that in a way that is counterfactual. So you're understanding, would this impact have happened if this program didn't run? And then finally, we're bringing all that together into learning and adapting programs. So bringing insights and conclusions from both the monitoring and the evaluation to then feed back in to updating the theory of change, tweaking the intervention. And this is a continuous process of working through these elements. For one thing I would say on this before we move on is that for a lot of organizations, there's a desire to want to do impact assessment, evaluation sort of stuff as soon as possible. Donors love when you can say you're sparing this many animals per dollar, but actually in terms of improving intervention effectiveness, especially for interventions that are early stage, getting good monitoring in place is much more effective for generating insights that improve that program. And evaluation to do it right and well is, because it's so costly and long term, it can it's something that is better done when that program has sort of reached a stage of maturity. So I think that's something to kind of bear in mind, because we see a lot of kind of desire for evaluation when actually monitoring is the thing that is good to have in place. I would love to do a quick test of this chat-based interaction that we're going to do today. So if you could throw into the chat whether you're doing any of these things at your organization or in your work. So put an A in the chat if you're building a theory of change, B if you're collecting any monitoring data, C if you're conducting or have conducted an evaluation, or D if you've not done any ME or L work yet, or E if you're unsure. And there's no right or wrong answer here at all. It is just helpful to get a sense of where everyone is at in the chat. That'll help me like tailor the talk a little bit as we progress through. I touched a little bit on why you might want a theory of change, but there are a couple of other reasons in addition to that MEL cycle. So the first thing that I've already talked about is that theories of change form that blueprint for generating evidence, right? It really underpins all subsequent monitoring and evaluation work. So having that in place is a crucial step in that journey. But another component of this is it's really useful for aligning program staff. So when you go through the process of developing the theory of change, you're going to be uncovering your beliefs and assumptions, and you might find that everyone on your team has quite different beliefs and assumptions, even if you've even been in the same team for quite a long period of time, and you actually start to talk this out and put it down on paper. It becomes quite an interesting exercise in actually understanding how people are thinking about things, because it can be quite different when you try and put that down, and working through that together and is really good for aligning program staff towards a collective like vision towards your end goal. It really like helps clarify things. because it's quite a visual exercise, as we'll see, that then can be used to onboard new staff. It gives a really clear overview of the work that you're doing in that regard. So it has kind of these kind of communication uses internally, but also externally. Having what we often advise organizations to do is have an internal theory of change that's a bit more complicated and serves for their monitoring and evaluation, but also reduce that down into a simplified version that has the kind of key elements of the work that they're doing to serve as a communication tool for donors, because it is a really quick way of communicating an overview of the work that you're doing and why you're doing it. So there are a few additional benefits beyond just the monitoring and evaluation work. So that's the why of theory of change. Let's take a look at what a theory of change is and build up a clearer picture of that. Obviously, it's a theory of how and why your initiative, your program, your intervention is working, or how you think it will work. We break it down into logical steps and represent that visually. And it takes us from the initial activities that we're carrying out through to the different outcomes that we're looking to achieve to get that final impact. And I want to stress that it should be something that's continuously evolving. Sometimes it's thought of, you create the theory of change when you create it at the start of an intervention, but and then you just leave it, and it kind of informs that initial design. Really, a theory of change to be useful, it should be continuously evolving as you learn more about your program, as you tweak your direction. If you find you're not updating your theory of change, it probably means then that the theory of change is not doing much in terms of being useful for your program. And that might be because it's not forming a basis for monitoring and evaluation, or it's kind of, sat there in isolation. Also, I've talked a lot about introducing a theory of change at the start of developing a program. If you've already got a program that's been going for a while, it can still be very useful to build a theory of change for that program, to actually test and put down onto paper how you think that is working. What is it not? Well, it's not a chronological sequence of events. A lot of theories of change appear to be chronological sequences of events, but it's important to bear in mind that this isn't the case, because it's more broken up by the type of thing, as we'll see. And so you might have several things that happen at different phases in time that are next to each other in a theory of change. So I think that can be important to bear in mind when you're developing or reading a theory of change, that it's not chronological necessarily, although it can appear to be chronological. It's not a systems map that shows the actors and flows of resources. So systems thinking is a kind of parallel school of thought to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. They both have their uses in terms of strategy and understanding how the dynamics of change work, but they are separate things. So a systems map is not the same as a theory of change. If you come across one of those or want to develop one of those for your program, they are very useful. So they are something to look into, but it is a separate in its goal. And as I've said, they're not a static document used at the start. They should be continuously evolving. And they're not a magical solution. Like any tool, they will have their limitations. If you entirely rely on theory of change for strategy, it's not going to be the best. You need a mixture of things, but there is a lot that we can get from it, as we'll continue to explore. So let's talk about levels. So a theory of change can be applied at lots of different levels of kind of zoom, I suppose. So you could look at the landscape level, like sort of a movement-wide theory of change. Say you wanted to think about how you might end factory farming in a country, then you could do a theory of change for that, where you look at all of the different organizations, the funders, the stakeholders, and how their work is interacting with each other to bring about this longer term goal. You can look at the organization level. So you take your whole organization, all the interventions that you do, and map that out, and the interrelations between interventions then become the kind of key part of that to see how things fit together, where there might be gaps in strategy, or connections that could be made that you currently aren't making between your interventions. And then there's the intervention program level, where you're looking specifically at the intervention itself, the activities that you're carrying out for that intervention. And as we go down each kind of level, it becomes more detailed in terms of what's actually been carried out and the work that's being done. And so yeah, these are kind of the 3 levels. If you're starting out and you haven't built a theory of change yet, and your organization's got a few different interventions, rather than starting at the organization level, as it can be tempting to do, we recommend groups start at pick an interventional program, particularly one that is the simplest or easiest to map out. Start there and build a theory of change for that program, and then once you've done that for all your programs, then it becomes easier then to build an organizational level theory of change. It can be difficult to go in the other direction sometimes, to start at the organization level and go down to then the program level, because each kind of level of abstraction is kind of harder to get to a good theory of change. So let's look at a simple example that we'll kind of work with as I break down the different elements. So here we've got a community outreach program where workshops are being delivered on the benefits of veganism. You can see we can break up each step of this. So we've got on the left-hand side, the activity we're carrying out, the workshops to teach the community members. We're then the first initial outcomes we're expecting to see after the workshops have been held are that the community members understand the benefits of veganism. That leads to them decreasing animal product consumption, and that leads to the fewer animals being alive in factory farms, which leads to a decrease in animal suffering. So I'm not saying that this is definitely going to happen as expected, but this is the theory of how we think this program is going to work in this example. So we can see that on the left-hand side, broadly, we've got the actions that we're carrying out, and we're expecting then community members to take action as a result of that. And then that having an end result for our beneficiaries, our animals, right, at the end, with the final impact that we're hoping to see. So it can be useful to think of a theory of change in these kind of 3 broad categories. And we do this for our own internal theory of change. If we do this, then people will do this, which will result in this, is a really powerful way of simply breaking down a theory of change, especially when you're getting started. But we can get a little bit more technical and break down each component. And I'm going to start on the right-hand side. And the reason for doing that is that when you're building a theory of change, it is much easier to start with the impact and work your way back to activities. So always start from the right, rather than start with your activities and then try and map out the outcomes you might see and try and then get to impact. If you try and do it that way, you will end up with a very complicated web of things that might lead to all kinds of different impacts, and it becomes messy. So always start with your impact and work your way backwards. And that will help structure and keep things focused on exactly what that impact that you're trying to realize is. So impact is the ultimate change that you're trying to achieve. Once everything's said and done, the success of the program hinges on whether you're realizing that thing. Then we have our outcomes. So our outcomes are the intermediate steps, or the steps that go from the work that you're actually carrying out, that need to be achieved in order to realize that final impact. And each one builds off the other, right? You can't have this intermediate outcome without first securing this early outcome. You can't have this final outcome without securing this intermediate outcome. and you can't have this impact without securing this final outcome. Then you have the output. So this is the direct consequence of the activity that you're carrying out. And then you have your activity, which is the work that you're doing. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on these outcomes and how we can develop them in a way that is useful and reflects kind of how behavior change happens. So at the Mission Motor, we like to use this CASB framework, as it's called. When we're thinking about outcomes, often we want to see behavior change of some sort happen. So in this case, we want to see behavior change happen in the community to start eating more plant-based food or consuming less animal products. So when we're thinking about behavior change, what we do is we use behavior change models to help us understand that. And there are several behavior change models out there, and I would encourage you to do a bit of research. This CASB model is just one of those. I'll show another one in a little bit as well. We like this one because it's quite simple, straightforward. It works quite well in a lot of circumstances. And it's useful for thinking about the things that you might need to realize in order to secure the behavior change that you're looking for. It's fairly self-explanatory. Knowledge is the information and facts that an individual possesses in order for them to carry out a particular behavior. If they understand what it is, what needs to be done and why it's important, then that's often like the first step in securing behavior change. Attitudes are about feelings and beliefs, whether they've really internalized that feeling that this behavior change is a positive thing, and that if you've secured that, then it creates the motivation and the kind of emotional support required to engage in that behavior. And then finally, skills are more the kind of practical abilities and competencies. If you've got that in place, you know how to enact behavior, and so you can do. So often we need to see like maybe 2 out of these 3 things to start to see behavior change happening, or all 3 ideally. And so if we return to our simple example, we can see that we've got the early outcome here of community members understand the benefits of veganism, and we've got the intermediate outcome here of decreasing animal product consumption. So we can see quite quickly that this is a knowledge outcome, and this is a behavior outcome. And yeah, so we can see how that kind of connects up. So when we're building this theory of change, having these frameworks in mind makes it easier to think about how change might actually happen in practice. And these models are kind of tested, validated models for behavior change. So this brings us to our first little task. So I'm going to pause for a couple of minutes, and I'm going to ask you to write down one of the 3 of these things. So think about your own work in your organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be the work that you're directly doing. It could be the work of your organization as a whole, whatever works for you. But pick a knowledge or behavior outcome combo, an attitude outcome and behavior outcome combo, or a skill outcome leading to a behavior outcome combo, and then just note that down. If you'd like to share that in the chat, then that would be great. It would be really cool to see some of these things come in, and yeah, and I'll pause for a couple of minutes to give you a little point to think that through. If anyone's got any questions about this at this stage, then feel free to jump in as well, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. Okay, we've got some loads of examples starting to come in, which is really good to see. Yeah, this is really cool. So this it looks like everyone is understanding well this this kind of connection. And it's really, I always love doing things like this because it's really inspiring to see all the work that you're all doing, and understand things better. So yeah, we can kind of see how this starts to come together and apply to our own work, even if you haven't got a theory of change right now, right? This is like, you can see how adding like building elements up like this can lead to that theory of change development. Please keep sharing these in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on them as we're going to kind of go on. Or if you don't want to share it in the chat, that's absolutely fine. Just keep it written down, because we will return to it later, because we're going to build off it and use this as a mini example of a theory of change that we're then going to do some additional things with as we go on. And the same if you're watching on YouTube Live, keep it written down, and we'll go from there as we go on. I'm going to touch on another like outcome category or outcome behavior model before we move on. So this is the capability, opportunity, motivation, behavior model. Whilst we recommend organizations use CASB as a starting point with this, you might find, depending on what work you're doing, that doesn't work that well. Another alternative to look into is this model, the CONB model. This breaks down things slightly differently. So we've got capability, and that itself is broken down into psychological capability, which is knowledge, mental skills, cognitive abilities, and then physical capability, which are physical skills, strength, stamina. You've got motivation, which is broken down into reflective motivation, which is conscious decision making, planning, beliefs, and then automatic motivation, which are emotions, habits, impulses, the things that kind of intrinsically, automatically happen within us. And then opportunity, there's physical opportunity, which are environmental factors that enable a behavior or hinder a behavior. And then there's the social opportunity, the cultural norms, the social cues that influence our behavior. And again, if you've got these things in place, that enables behavior change. So you can see this is a slightly more complex way of breaking things down, but with that complexity can come richer insights. So, and it, depending on the type of work you're doing, this can be something to experiment with if you're finding the CASB model is not proving too useful, or you feel like there is something kind of like missing. So again, if we look at our simple example, we can see that this, in this case, would be capability leading to behavior change. And this, because this is knowledge, it's psychological capability, having the knowledge, mental skills to perform the behavior. I want to pause there to think about the kind of big picture of early outcomes in particular. So early outcomes are the things that directly follow after our initial activities and work. And I just want to highlight that they do have a unique value for demonstrating project impact. So a couple of components to that. They're attributable because they're immediately following that work that you're doing. It's easier to make a case that what the work you're doing is leading to that outcome because it's the thing you're expecting to immediately see afterwards. And they're meaningful because they're necessary steps to reach your final outcomes or your impact. But they you don't need to do a full evaluation to be able to determine whether your early outcomes are happening, right? This is something that we can get at with collecting regular monitoring data, maybe running surveys, or information gathering approaches, depending on what exactly it is that you're doing. And that is a lot less expensive than like trying to do a big evaluation, a randomized controlled trial being the kind of gold standard of that, although we don't see too many of those happening in the animal space. So making sure that you've got this kind of measuring happening in place, or this monitoring happening in place for your early outcomes, can then be really beneficial to share that with donors, because it shows that you can then positively demonstrate these early outcomes happening. Donors like to see those that frequent evidence of results taking place. So it's something to kind of bear in mind in your theory of change, that this can be a good leverage point. Now, an important thing to distinguish is the difference between the outputs and the early outcomes. So we've talked about this a little bit already. We know now that early outcomes are the in knowledge, attitude, skills, using that framework, and they're directly associated with the program, and that outputs are the direct consequence of the activities that we're carrying out. The key difference here is that the outputs and the activities, that's what we can directly control, right? Out at the activity, we're looking to carry out workshops. The output is that we've carried out those workshops. They've happened, and that's something we can monitor. The early outcomes as to whether people absorb the knowledge of those workshops, we don't have as much control of that. And as we go through our later stage outcomes, we have less and less control as things go on. And that really is the key of thing to take away from this, right? It's easier to measure the stuff happening early on because we have direct control of it. As you get later and later in the process, there are outside external factors that are influencing the outcomes beyond your own control. So I just wanted to highlight that as a bear in mind with program design. So we now have our theory of change in place. And the question is, what next? What do we do with it? How to make use of it doesn't just kind of and get that once every 6 months or something. So the next step that we encourage to go through in the process is looking at assumptions and risks. What are they? So assumptions are the things that you're implicitly and assuming when you're thinking about how your theory works. So whether you've thought about it or not, you will have made assumptions in any theory of change. And so turning those implicit assumptions into explicit assumptions that you've written down and carefully thinking through each step of the theory of change is really useful to understanding where there might be weaknesses or things that need to be in place for this theory to work. Assumptions have to hold up in order for the program to work. That is the key part of the definition of what an assumption is. And we'll look at some examples and see that. Risks are then factors that can significantly affect the program outputs and outcomes. So they might be external or internal. More commonly, they are external factors, things that you don't have control over, things that may not happen. And if they do happen, they're going to cause an issue with your theory of change, like bearing out as you expect it to. As we'll see, the difference between assumptions and risks is a bit gray. You can kind of see them as two sides of the same coin, right? You can kind of rewrite an assumption as being a risk, or rewrite a risk as being an assumption. So I would say when you're developing these, just see which one sort of it makes sense to naturally frame it as. And again, an important reminder that the world outside your program isn't constant, right? The situations around us change a lot, and that affects the assumptions and risks that again in fact affect your theory of change. Which is another reason why this is something that should be revisited, especially if there's been a particular societal change that then affects things. So if we return to our simple example, And we'll put in some assumptions and risks for each of these steps. So looking at the connection between the activity and the output, an assumption might be that we're assuming the public transport is running on the day of the training so that people can make it to the workshops themselves. And if the public transport isn't running, then people can't make it to the workshops, and then this might not work. And then we can think about a risk of the workshops not being run as expected. So maybe we've trained up volunteers to run these workshops around the country, and they haven't taken on that training, or they're not running things as you would expect, and then that means the workshops haven't been delivered, the knowledge hasn't been communicated. Similarly, the step between workshops being held and community members understanding the benefits of veganism. Perhaps the curriculum addresses, the curriculum, we assume that the curriculum is addressing relevant benefits. So particularly if we're like applying material that has been developed to be used in one culture, and we're using it in a different culture in our own circumstances, we need to make sure that curriculum is then relevant to the culture in which we're engaging things, and that can lead to all sorts of problems or lack of effectiveness if we don't factor that in. And a risk related to that would be that community members do not feel engaged, and that could be for a number of reasons. That could be to do with how the workshops are being delivered. It could be to do with the content. So we can see how we build up at each stage these risks and assumptions. And it might be the case that you've got several risks for one link and not so many for another link. And in terms of going through the process of coming up with these, you can either really specifically look at each link and go like, what are the risks and assumptions for this? Or you can look at your theory of change as a whole and talk through like, okay, where do we see the biggest assumptions we're making here? Where are the biggest risks coming up? That could be useful, especially if you've been working with your program a lot already, because you'll have a better sense of exactly how that program is working, and sometimes the process of going through, if you've got quite a large and complicated theory of change with lots of elements kind of tying together in different ways, it can be quite a laborious process to go through and write down come up with assumptions for each causal link. So I would recommend starting with this kind of bigger picture view, and seeing how that yields things. But then if not, then focusing on those each individual kind of link in the theory of change and coming up with specific assumptions.
This means that Jamie, your time is coming up, so could you go quickly? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I need to go very quickly. How long do I have?
If you can wrap it up in 2 minutes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, yes. Right, so unfortunately, I think we're gonna have to skip some of the tasks. I will the presentation will be shared afterwards, so I would recommend kind of going through these tasks, and it will demonstrate more concretely the value. We've got material here on how to best write assumptions and risks to make sure they're measurable. And the key thing about measurability, the assumptions and risks, that we want to be able to measure them. Then I've got some sections about prioritization. How do we figure out which ones are the most important? Again, I think look through these slides afterwards, because I want to get to this slide, and I will finish up on this slide. Apologies for overrunning. This is the first time I've done this presentation, but let's wrap things up with this slide, and we'll go from there into questions. Okay, so the ultimate purpose of developing these assumptions and risks is to be able to test different aspects and elements of your program and know what indicators to look out for. To test whether your program is running as you think it is. So let's say that your program is up and running, but you're not seeing the final outcome, right? You're not seeing these community members go vegan in this case. And it's been up and running for a while. So you're starting to think, okay, something here isn't working. Then having a theory of change with the identified assumptions and risks allows you to break down your program and figure out exactly why it isn't working so that you can attempt to fix it. So if we look at this second line here, where we've got risks and assumptions coming up in the implementation that are causing issues. So let's say, for an example, that we're using volunteers to run workshops to train community members. And there are lots of volunteers who've said they can run these workshops across the country. We can't all attend these workshops we can't attend all the workshops to monitor whether they're taking place as we expect. And we know that there's a risk that the volunteers say they don't end up delivering the workshops as we expect. So we can test this risk then by asking volunteers to report the dates that they held the workshops, report workshop attendance. Maybe we randomly pick a sample to go and attend to see if things are taking place as we expect. And then by verifying this, you can confirm that the program is being implemented as expected, or whether it's being implemented as expected. So let's say that's fine, and you've tested that and it looks okay. You're happy that the workshop is being implemented. Then we look at the second step. So let's say the workshops took place as expected. They had good attendance, but still the program's not working. You're not getting the final outcome. So the next stage is determining whether the community members understand the content of the workshops. And to assess this, you could introduce a pre and post survey to understand how people's knowledge is changing before and after the workshop. You realize maybe that people are not understanding the content of the workshop and end up confused. So then you decide to revise the content and train the volunteer workshop leaders in exactly how to deliver those workshops, right? So you can then recognize that's where the issue is. And let's say you test that again and everything's fine and it's working. So then maybe you've got an issue in the later stages of your theory of change. So with this third X here, between understanding the benefits of veganism and becoming vegan, it might be the case they understand the benefits, but they're understanding the benefits, but then you determine through a follow-up survey, for example, that they don't feel confident cooking vegan food and need more workshops focused on cooking skills. So you've got the knowledge component, but again, coming back to the behavioral change model, maybe you don't have the skills element in place in order to secure the behavior change that you're looking for. So then you introduce a second type of workshop to teach vegan cooking. So as you can see, identifying and testing the key assumptions and risks becomes really important for effective program implementation and design. And doing this ahead of time means you have things mapped out so you know where the pitfalls might be and you know what to test as you go through and run your programs. Again, I've got a few pitfall slides on things to look out for in theories of change. There's enough content and detail in here, I think, in these slides to read through. So I'm going to have to run through all of this, I'm afraid. Again, resources. Importantly, my email is there. Hit me up anytime with questions. And we'll finish there. Apologies again for overrunning a little bit, but I hope there was a lot of useful content in that. And thank you a lot for your time and attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. And it was quite detailed, and I would say it was quite like a workshop. So I think if somebody would go through your material, they would really have a lot of insight in there. So thank you once again for giving us the time. And sorry that you had to run through the couple of slides. But, so there are some questions that we've also got here, and I'll post the first one. So it says, how do you address the unintended consequences or unknown risks when designing theory of change?
How do you intend unattended? Okay. so I think it's taking the time to like think through and map out and particularly answer the question. So as you're going through the process of mapping out like the risks and assumptions, I think thinking about if this program goes wrong, how is it going to go wrong? And really working through the different stages of your theory of change and thinking about those kind of failure points that might happen. I think that's a really useful line of questioning to get better a better understanding of where those risks are, those unintended things. And the other side of sort of unintended consequences can be effects that happen to people that are not your direct stakeholders, right? In this case, we were looking at community members, but there might be people that are not attending those workshops in the wider community that are also affected by the actions that we're taking. And so thinking through that wider network of individuals and how the work you're doing might be affecting that wider system can then be useful at getting to some of the possible unintended consequences.
Thank you so much. And another question that I would pose, and somebody put it here in the chat also, are there any AI tools to help developing theory of change with risk assessments and other monitoring and evaluation learning analysis tools?
Yeah, really good question. Something that we're keeping an eye out on, as well. So I think just having some back and forth with ChatGPT can be a pretty effective way of doing things. I think there is a bit of hallucination and error there, but like there is a lot of value of using that as just a brainstorming tool. We use Miro to build our theories of change. Miro has just introduced a suite of kind of AI related features. I haven't really looked into exploring them too much, but I think there could be some kind of grounds there to provide support. There aren't that many like dedicated MEL tools. It is something we're looking into as an organization, whether there is scope to build some sort of like assistant that kind of does similar work to what we do to reach out, but then it's just, everyone can kind of jump in and make use of that. We have got a lot of demand for MEL services at the moment, so having something like that in place could be really useful. The other thing I would say is that Google's Notebook LM tool, that's really useful for like if you take the resources that you've got that I've provided in the links in the presentation, and you upload those resources into Notebook LM, you can create a workspace that references all of that information, right? So it's really good for loading up resources about a topic, asking questions, or kind of brainstorming, and have the responses of the kind of AI tool reference the actual like material itself around that. So Notebook LM is another avenue to look into, I would say.
Thank you, Jamie. So, one of the questions which I also personally have is the first time when you start doing a theory of change, as an organization, you find that you may not really know the subject. You may not have a monitoring and evaluation person on your team or somebody who can help you develop this. So how as a grassroots organization or as an NGO, can you make it, if I may say, more fun for yourself and also not like a difficult exercise that becomes like a major task for you?
Yeah. So I think one of the pitfalls I had listed on my last slide was don't forget to have fun. This can be it's a difficult exercise that takes up a lot of brain power, but I think like really framing things as like it being an opportunity to generate insights and learn and understand about how your program is doing, and it being it's a really interesting communication tool in itself to have those conversations with your staff and team members, really try and get things down. It's very it can be quite an electric thing if you frame it in that way. The other thing I would say on that has evaporated from my thoughts, unfortunately. So oh yeah. The other thing I would say is in the resources, I've linked to something called the MEL playbook, which was developed by a couple of Mission Motor team members prior to them joining the Mission Motor. That breaks down things in a really accessible and straightforward way. And it's a really good initial guide if you're going through things yourself to reference and guide you through the process. So I would really recommend that resource. There are quite a few theory of change resources that are quite heavy and dense, and this is really easy to get engaged with.
Thank you. So, there was one slide where you were talking about behavior change in terms of capacity and motivation, and the third factor was there. I'm sorry, I don't recall. But then there's a question about it, that how about when sometimes human behavior changes are not logical, like they're unpredictable? How do you then work them in the theory of change?
Yeah, that's really difficult. So what I would say about these kind of behavioral change models is that they've existed in literature for a while. They've been used in a lot of like research studies, and so they are attempts to draw out the important elements of that lead to behavior change. So of course they are just models, right? They are reducing complex human thought, feeling, emotion, thinking into behavior. So I think they're a useful tool to have a good starting point in your theory of change. But if you put things through that approach, that lens, and you still find that something is missing, something is not working, and every intervention is going to be very specific and unique to the circumstances in which you're carrying it out. And so listening to what's going on in your intervention and recognizing that these models aren't always going to work perfectly, and not being afraid to introduce outcomes that maybe aren't part of these models, but do reflect what you're seeing happen when you try and carry out this intervention. Yeah, don't be afraid to kind of play with things and break out of the specific molds of these kind of guidances, because inevitably things don't work out exactly as intended.
Thank you. And I think this can be the last question, unless there are more questions in the chat. I would encourage anybody who has any question, please put them down here in the chat and we can take them. So there's another question that says, how and when should we communicate with the donors or our supporters about TOC, theory of change goals, when they cannot be fulfilled, when we see them not going the direction that we desire?
Yeah. This is a really difficult one, and this is something that we're trying to change. We're figuring out a kind of funders program at the Mission Motor. We would like to see more funders be more encouraging of situations where you've tried something out and it hasn't worked as expected, but you've learned from it and adapted your program. That should be universally seen as something that's really positive. I think the key thing is to frame it in a way of learning. We're in an experimental phase in our organization. We're trying things out, and we've tried this approach and it's not quite worked out as expected, but here is what we've learned from it. Here is how we're changing our program moving forward. Here's how we've updated our theory of change in light of this evidence that we've got. We've got this evidence collection in place. So as we develop our program, we will continue to see improvements, and it's about developing that narrative around using that evidence and data to improve things. Because of many organizations don't do that or aren't interested in doing that and aren't making those gains. So I think demonstrating to donors that you have those systems in place that allow you to recognize those things, right? It could also be the case that you're an organization, your program hasn't worked well, but you don't know why, and you can't point to specifically what's gone on. But I do agree at the moment there is an issue with donors saying, oh, the project failed, so we'll stop funding. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a bit of an agreement about it also. And there's one more question in the chat. I think you've sort of touched about this when we said how to make TOC fun for everyone. So it says who to include in your team when building a theory of change.
Yeah. I mean, it depends at the level at which you're going at. If you're talking about an organization level of theory of change, great to at various stages include the whole organization. I think if you have lots of people in the room initially, that can get very messy. So I think like if you're talking about building a theory of change for an intervention, then maybe you've got one person in the organization that is kind of taking on the role more of the kind of MEL person to push forward this kind of thing in the organization, and maybe you've got the program lead for that particular intervention. Having those two people as a starting point to get out an initial theory of change, I think that's great. And then you can even do it with one person, but I do think it helps to have a bit of back and forth. And then from there, then presenting that to the team, getting wider discussion. And yeah, kind of going from there really.
Thanks again, Jamie. So I think this one more question that has been posted here, it can also benefit CAPC in learning this because when we work with people on TOC, this does become a question. So how do you ensure that your theory of change is a living document and not a static one? So what is the frequency of reviewing or revising theory of change?
Yeah, I think it's hard to give a concrete like revisit it every 3 months or something, because it really depends on the type of work you're doing, right? If you're, say you're working on policy change and that you're talking about like years of work to get a particular outcome or something like that, you may not be revisiting things as frequently versus a situation like, I don't know, corporate welfare where you're, or corporate outreach where you're working with lots of groups very quickly and securing commitments and things like that. So things might change with different approaches and tactics. I think the key thing is going from a theory of change to having a monitoring framework where you've identified your key risks and assumptions and indicators that you're measuring, like we touched on in that final slide. For each, as we build out a monitoring framework, within that we specify at what interval we're collecting data for this thing. So once we've got that in place, we'll maybe lots of indicators are coming in monthly. And then in say 6 months, we know we'll have 6 months worth of monthly data. And that might then be enough to be like, right, okay, we can look at this, come back to our theory of change, and intentionally kind of go through and update things. So it all depends on what those data collection cycles are like. Yeah, I think that's the foundation through which I would determine when to update things.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering all the questions. And I think we've come to the end of our Q&A time. And once again, thanks a lot for taking out the time and doing this elaborate presentation for us. And at the same time, I want to thank all of our attendees here who've been patient, who've been participating and asking the questions. Thank you, everyone. And we can go back to the main room. Over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Sarita and Jamie, for this session. It was really captivating, and I'm sure the session itself, the slides, and the handbook are going to be really useful resources for anyone looking into developing their theory of change and MEL into their strategy. So thank you so much, Jamie, for this session. Just before we have a break now, I would just like to remind everyone that this is our 4th and last AfA Connect of 2024. And all of our previous AfA Connect sessions are available on YouTube already. So you can check that out. These sessions will be on YouTube as well when the event is over. And I'd also like to share with you a few events happening in 2025. So we're going to have a few online events with the 2nd year of International Macaque Week under AfA, the return of AFAD as an online day of raising awareness of the plight of farmed animals in Asia, and there will also be a day of capacity building for organizations in Asia, and World Rabies Day. And the AfA conference is also back in 2025 and hosted in Taipei. So I'm sure many of you are aware and familiar with the AfA conference, but it is the largest gathering of animal protection and advocacy organizations, and anyone can attend as well. So we have sessions next year on all sorts of topics, so from farmed animals to wildlife trafficking, to animal used in labs or in entertainment. We really have sessions tailored for anyone who's involved in the movement in any capacity. Registration opens soon, so make sure to follow us on social media or on our website to register as soon as the registration opens, and you can get your early bird tickets then. But in the meantime, if you're interested in speaking at the event, abstracts are not open until December 10th. So you can scan the code here, or you can head to asiaforanimals.com/conference-2025. I'm sure someone is probably adding the link in the chat as well. The sessions are really designed as really practical workshops for attendees. So if this is something that you'd like to attend or be a part of, then you can head over to our website to learn more. And in 2025, the AfA Farm Animal Coalition is also going to be hosting several farm regional events in 2025, starting with one in India in February, and we'll also have one in Indonesia, Nepal, and Pakistan. These regional events allow organizations to come together within a country, share challenges, but also share opportunities for collaboration. And it really allows us to unite the movement and to have collaborative efforts. So if you're based in any of these countries and you're interested in joining the regional events, get in touch with us. Overall, if you want to know more about our events, you can head to asiaforanimals.com/events, and we also have a mailing list that you can subscribe to if you want to receive any updates. Just a reminder that we also have the AfA podcast. If you haven't already, I'd really recommend checking it out. The episodes that we've released so far are really brilliant. So we've got guest speakers from all around the world speaking about all sorts of animal-related issues. For example, veganism, dog meat trade, fake rescue content on social media, protecting animals in disaster and conflict zones. So check out the podcast at asiaforanimals.com/podcast. All right, so we are now going to have a 10-minute break before continuing with the event. So after the break, we are going to have the AfA Policy Coalition session on lobbying strategies for animal policy, insights from regional and global advocacy efforts here in the main room. And then in the breakout room, we'll have the Sanctuaries and Rescue Centers Coalition session on social and behavior change tools to inspire society to change for wildlife and stop wildlife crimes. So enjoy your break and see you shortly.